Today we have a tale of a ship that set sail more than 450 years ago from a port near the Isle of Wight on the south coast of England. The ship and its crew were Henry VIII's pride and joy. They were tasked with protecting England against the invading French navy. However, despite the Mary Rose's best efforts, the ship capsized before even a single shot could be fired in that battle, and nearly 500 men died that day. July 19th, 1545. For more than 4 centuries, the ship that was once the pride of the royal fleet sat in its watery grave until it was raised live on TV and watched by more than 60 million people. This is the Mary Rose Museum. I'm Jessica, the Museum Guide, and today I'm taking you on a fully guided tour of a fascinating Tudor time capsule, the 500-year-old sunken shipwreck at the Mary Rose Museum in Portsmouth. Last spring, I was lucky enough to visit the legendary Mary Rose, docked now in the Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, also home to iconic ships such as the HMS Victory, Lord Nelson's flagship in the 1805 Battle of Trafalgar, and the iron-hulled HMS Warrior. And of course, these ships are incredibly interesting, but to me, nowhere near as interesting as the sunken hulk, the ghostly, ghastly cemetery of the Mary Rose, which was built here and sunk just off this coast, so close to home. On today's tour, we're going to explore the history of the ship, talk about how it was recovered, and see it in all of its splayed-apart glory. Then we will go to some of the galleries to visit the skeletal remains and skulls of the men and dog who were aboard the vessel, learning about their lives at sea. This is a fantastic museum, a huge endeavour using state-of-the-art conservation techniques and top-notch curation. I cannot wait to show you around. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm delighted to have you here, and I hope you'll stick around. If you're a regular viewer and you'd like even more content, head over to my Patreon account. There, I release at least one extra video tour for my patrons every month. In February, it was an hour-long tour of unusual little bits that I love in the British Museum. Let's talk about the experience of being here at the Mary Rose Museum. Now, of course, the low lighting helps to preserve the objects, but it also does so much more. It's incredibly atmospheric. We almost feel like we're in the depths of the sea with the dappled light and the movement of the water. Look at the craggy, rough wood. Being here, with its sense of decay, it's so eerie. But, as we'll talk about, the decay has been halted by science. This is half of the ship. It is an impressive 32 meters long, which really isn't that much longer than the Sutton Hoo, but since it is 3 decks tall, it really feels so much bigger. As you can see a glimpse of now, 62 projectors cast 3D imagery onto the hull of the ship, showing you what work and life was like here, and enriching the stories of the artifacts. Now, running alongside the ship is a series of displays that show us some of the objects discovered in the lower decks, and I'll be referencing these galleries a few times. There are galleries on either end of the ship, and as a visitor, you walk along this gangway along the wreckage 3 different times. This allows you, and us today, to see the ship from different heights and angles. It's fascinating. Let's head back to the entrance. When you enter the museum, you're greeted by a series of interactive displays and short films, which help to bring the story to life and set the tone for the entire experience. The Mary Rose was one of Henry VIII's favourite ships. It was built in 1510 to 1511, right at the beginning of his reign, and it sailed on voyages for 34 years, until it sank in 1545, and we'll get to the sinking, don't worry. Henry loved his ships. He saw the royal fleet grow from just a handful to 53 by the time he died in 1547, just 2 years after the Mary Rose sank. That means that the life of the Mary Rose, from 1510 to 1545, overlaps almost exactly with his reign, and it was his favourite vessel. The Mary Rose was constructed right here at Portsmouth at the same time as her sister ship, the remarkably silly named Peter Pomegranate. Some say that the Mary Rose was named for Henry's sister Mary Tudor, but there's actually no evidence to support that. Instead, the rose and the pomegranate symbolize the royal marriage between Henry and Catherine of Aragon. The pomegranate was a symbol of fertility bestowed upon Catherine when they married, but that turned out to be a bit of a bust when she only produced one heir, a girl. Now, the Mary Rose wasn't the largest in Henry's fleet. That honour went to the 1,000-ton Regent, but Edward Howard, admiral of the fleet, did choose it as the flagship, and Henry sent her into battle during his 1512 war against France. Over the next few decades, she was brought in and out of service whenever England was at war, and then peace, and then war again. It was real whiplash. In 1536, amidst mounting tensions after Henry's break with the Church in Rome, he ordered a refit and reinforcements for the Mary Rose. She was more fortified than ever, yes, but she also became more unwieldy and heavier. Henry led a fleet to Boulogne-sur-Mer in 1544, and it's likely that the Mary Rose was there. Most of the fleet was, and he captured the town. It was the retaliation against this act that led to the downfall, literally, of the Mary Rose. Now let's talk about the Battle of the Solent. I like here how it says, in this museum you will see objects similar to these in the painting. That really brings it to life. The Battle of the Solent occurred in July 1545. In retaliation for the seizure of Boulogne, the French admiral gathered over 200 ships, while the English were only able to amass around 80. John Dudley, the Viscount Lisle, was Lord Admiral of the fleet. He wasn't content to sit and wait to be attacked, so he sent fire ships to Le Havre and burned the French flagship. The French then landed at Sussex and then on the Isle of Wight, taking the English by surprise on the Solent. That's the name, by the way, of this 20-mile-long strait that separates the Isle of Wight from mainland Hampshire. Henry VIII was actually there on that day, dining on his then flagship, the Henri Grâce à Dieu, the Henry Grace of God, along with the Lord Admiral and the other captains, including Sir George Carew, captain of the Mary Rose and Vice Admiral of the fleet. When the French attacked, the king, quote, hurriedly left for the shore, but he had secret talks with the Lord Admiral and with Sir George Carew. According to the written records, he, quote, took off his chain from his neck with a great whistle of gold, and did put it around the neck of the said Sir George, giving him also therewith many good and comfortable words. The gold whistle, by the way, has sadly never been found. The French had a serious advantage due to the weather. There wasn't much wind, but they had oared galleys that they could operate and even fire from, while the English ships were rendered immobile. Everyone would have been panicking on board, and Carew would have sprung into action when the wind rose in the afternoon, and that is when disaster struck. See, the Mary Rose didn't sink from a French attack. It sank through what Francois Vanderdelft, an eyewitness to the battle, called misfortune and carelessness. He wrote to King Charles V of France, quote, the ship foundered, and all hands on board, to the number of about 500, were drowned, though he notes that a few did escape. Tragically, it is thought that this anti-boarding netting trapped the men in the sinking ship. It was supposed to stop enemies from gaining access to the ship, but it prevented them from escaping out of the lower decks. Horrible. He then writes, in code, by the way, I made inquiries of one of the survivors, a Fleming, how the ship perished, and he told me the disaster was caused by their not having closed the lowest row of gun ports on one side of the ship. Having fired the guns on that side, she was turning in order to fire from her other, when the wind caught her sails so strongly as to heel her over, and plunged her open gun ports beneath the water, which floored and sank her. They say, however, that they can recover the ship and the guns. Dear viewer, they could not recover them. Despite the loss of the poor Mary Rose, the English did eventually scare the French into retreat, but the nearly 500 souls, and Hatch, the dog, and the ship remained in the Solent until the 1980s, nearly 5 centuries later. One quick note. A lot of people think that the Mary Rose sank on her first voyage, but you may be getting the story of the Vasa and the Mary Rose confused. See, the Vasa is another great warship, this one in Sweden, that is also the centerpiece of a state-of-the-art museum. But while the Mary Rose served for 34 years, the Vasa did indeed sink on her first voyage in 1628. The Vasa was raised in 1961, and due to the cold, brackish water of the Stockholm harbour, it is actually in better shape. It's 98% complete. It's also much bigger than the Mary Rose. It's nearly twice the length, and it weighs 3 times as much. I was lucky enough to visit the Vasa Museum a few years ago, and I would love to go back. Today's video is sponsored by Foreo, creator of the FAQ 202 silicone LED face mask. I spend a lot of time on camera, but I also believe strongly in science. I only use evidence-based skincare. Ever since I started using the FAQ 202 face mask a few months ago, I've been getting tons of compliments on my skin, and I've really noticed that it's smoother and a lot softer. That's probably because the FAQ 202 uses 8 different wavelengths, including NIR. That stands for Near Infrared Photon, and it is the most effective light treatment on the market for penetrating the skin. NIR has been clinically proven to address all kinds of skin concerns, like redness, acne, wrinkles, and hyperpigmentation. Best of all, it's wireless, so I can use it while I'm editing videos, but also while I'm traveling. It's also really easy to use. I just connect my Foreo mask to their app. They have all kinds of preset treatments, but you can use it without the app as well. Foreo is offering amazing Women's Day deals right now. Use my code 30museum for an additional 30% off almost all Foreo products, and that code is stackable on sale items as well. Click the link below and get yours now. Now let's get back to the Mary Rose. Now let's look at a few of the artifacts before we talk about how the ship was raised and the construction of this wonderful museum. Here's one of the ship's cannons. This cannon was cast from bronze, which is relatively easy to cast, and so you can see it's very highly decorated. This one has this really goofy lion's head. I do think it is supposed to be majestic. This gun weighs 2,463 kilos. That's 5,000 pounds, plus the weight of the oak carriage. This was serious artillery. And this, by the way, is a very necessary tool to use with it. It's called a linstock, from the Dutch lontstock or fuse stick. The gun captains used these to light the fuses of the guns. This allowed the gun captain to keep his distance. Very smart. For something so functional, these were very ornate, and they're actually really beautiful. This lumpen piece of wood was uncovered during dives in 2005. Divers weren't looking for this unusually shaped timber, but they thought it might be something interesting, and they were right. It's badly damaged by all that time under the sea, but it clearly had carvings on both sides, and we can see 3 holes that could have been used for iron fixings to secure it to the ship. This is further supported by this Tudor rose on the bow of the ship in this Anthony Roll painting. This is, in fact, the emblem of the Mary Rose, and it's the first known example of an emblem on an English warship that represents the name of the ship. This might actually be the origin of the tradition of figureheads that later became common on English ships for the next few centuries. I love stuff like this. Let's look here at the bronze Mary Rose bell, recovered from the deep in much better nick than the ship's badge. This was one of the final items that underwater archaeologists recovered from the site. It was found under the ship below the starboard side. The Flemish inscription reads, "I was made in the year 1510. Flemish inscriptions always personify inanimate objects, and I love that. This is the same year that the boat was commissioned, and that makes this so special. This bell would have been rung to mark the change of the watch and to warn other ships in poor weather. Time was kept on board with sand hourglasses, and some were found near where the bell was originally located. This really reminds me of the difficulties of keeping time on board a ship like this. I talk about that at length in my video about the Royal Observatory in London." Always nice when the museums include the tactile objects. This is becoming more and more common. Look at these bronze guns. This is an incredibly impressive collection of guns and weapons. They were very important to the ship. I mean, they were the ship's entire purpose. The boat's life started with guns, and it was rediscovered because of guns. See, in 1836, a man called John Dean found a bronze gun at the site, which triggered, pun intended, his curiosity. Other people began working the site, and there was always a suspicion that this is where the Mary Rose had sunk. Then, in 1970, Alexander McKee uncovered this, quote, old wrought iron gun at the site, which eventually led to finding the first timbers in May of 1971. Incredible. Now don't worry, we're going to come back to the raising of the Mary Rose very soon. These big guns would have originally been mounted on four-wheeled carriages. These rarely survive, except in these waterlogged conditions, so these have told archaeologists and historians a lot about the weaponry of the period. Now, if you're a regular viewer, you know that I regularly cover medical museums, and I always seem to find some grisly medical bits no matter where I go. They call to me. Today is no exception as we explore the objects associated with the surgeon on board the Mary Rose. He is a bit of a mystery. We don't know his name, but one of the pewter plates here in his chest is engraved with the initials W.E., so it's likely William, a very common name at the time. He was a member of the Company of Barbers and Surgeons. That means he underwent a 7-year apprenticeship under a master surgeon, passed exams, and became a senior member himself. His lovely pewter items and purse loaded with silver coins indicate that he was a rich man, well paid for his services on board. He would be the main point of call on the ship for anyone ailing, treating pain and disease, seeing to injuries, and administering first aid. Amidst the wreckage of the surgeon's cabin, archaeologists have discovered many different medical tools, including pliers for pulling out teeth. He was a dentist too, after all. Just look at this photo of a brutal cavity of one of the men on the Mary Rose. Like all early modern surgeons, he would have been trained in doing amputations, but performing them came with incredible danger. Remember, this was long before the germ theory of medicine and pain management. Surgeons worked incredibly quickly, cutting through flesh and bone, and then cauterizing wounds. You can see a Tudor bone saw here. The blade has been reconstructed in an outline. We can see the surgeon's bloodletting equipment. In the 16th century, people still very much believed in the 4 humors of the body, the belief that we have 4 liquids that make us sick when they are imbalanced. The main way to balance the humors was to bleed a patient. Leeches were expensive and hard to maintain, so surgeons would use small scalpels called lancets. They would catch the blood in bowls like this one. Look here at these medicines. Many of them are still in their original containers, including 9 wooden ointment jars and this wooden container of peppercorns, used as a kind of gas reliever. The surgeon also had at least 1 pewter syringe, which would have been used to inject mercury, which was also found on board. This was a common cure-all, and remember, cure-alls cure nothing. Syringes like this one could also be used up the urethra, for flushing the urethra with caustic fluids. That sounds horrible. There were knit combs like this. 82 have been found on board. Nice for keeping your hair free of knits and clean. A bone manicure set. You know, people may not have known about hygiene, but they knew that if you kept your nails cleaner, you were less likely to get sick. If you did get sick, though, here's a wooden pomander. A pomander is a small decorative ball that you could wear as a piece of jewelry or carry in your pocket. It would be filled with strong-smelling herbs or seeds that you could use to smell and ward off the miasma, or bad smells, that were said to make you sick. I talk about these at length in my video about the strangest things in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Speaking of smells, you can see me here smelling some of the smells. I love these smelling activities that I'm seeing in more museums lately. This is all about engaging the senses and engaging with a museum in new ways. This is especially good for children and obviously for people with impaired senses. Now here he is, the museum's mascot. This is Hatch, a skeletal lurcher, the remains of the ship's ratting dog, and though you might think he's a bit scary, think again. Here is my then 18-month-old immediately recognizing him.
Yes.
He would have been a very useful good boy, but also offered the men a source of companionship and mirth during long days at sea. The University of Portsmouth undertook DNA analysis on his teeth, and from that we know that he was a young adult male, between 18 and 24 months old, with a light brown and dark brown coat, and he likely lived out his entire life on the ship. Modern breeds hadn't yet been developed, but he was most closely related to the modern Jack Russell Terrier. That said, phenotypically he also shows similarities to Whippets. The museum refers to him as a lurcher, which is a Terrier-Whippet cross. His body was discovered in one of the Carpenter's cabins. There were 6 carpenters on board, but we think he died just outside, and scavenger marine life might have pulled his remains inside the room. Archaeologists recovered 55 of his bones. They were only preserved in such a fashion because his body was trapped between 2 chests when the ship settled on the seabed, prevented his wee bones from floating away. Now, if you grew up thinking Hatch was a girl, you're not alone. Though most of his skeleton was recovered, there was no sign of his baculum, or penis bone, and so the museum used to refer to this dog as a she. However, in 2014, Hatch's tooth enamel was analysed, and it proved that Hatch was actually a boy. Good boy. Alongside Hatch, we have some other objects found in the carpenter's cabin. This carpenter had his own cabin with a sliding door. You can see it here with tools and benches and a bed. Fittingly, he's also done some DIY and built himself an extension and a window that he cut through the side of the ship. Look at this backgammon set here with the carpenter's belongings. It's complete with plain counters, a leather pot and dice, and just look at how the rich wood has been restored so beautifully, even after it's sat on the ocean floor for nearly 500 years. It's a poignant reminder of the humanity of the people who didn't just work aboard this ship, but who lived and played here too. It's so human. The archaeologists didn't just find the carpenter's dog and his backgammon board. They found a whole heap of tools and clothes that likely belonged to one of these men, as well as his remains just below the carpenter's cabin. Isotope analysis of his teeth showed that he was likely from the Mediterranean. Many members of the Mary Rose's crew were Spanish, so he could have hailed from Spain. I love looking at personal belongings in a museum like this, like shoes. He also had a very fancy walnut wood chest with dovetail joints and special hinges. It contained 4 pewter plates, silver coins and rings, and a leather book cover, probably his prized possessions. The gunner was in charge of all guns, shot, and gunpowder on the ship, as well as training the men on how to use them. His cabin was identified by his chest, which contained gunner's tools, as well as so many neat little treasures. Look here, this is a Maltese cross. This was very delicate and expensive, as well as these tiny little bone dice. These are so cool. These remind me of the ones actually that I showcased in my mudlarking video. The master gunner also had a dagger decorated with images of a king and queen, as well as the only silver dress pin on the entire ship. He did really well. But look here at this. This is his Bollock or Bollock dagger. I also talked about these in my mudlarking video. There were 65 Bollock daggers on board the Mary Rose. Yes, that name is, you're hearing it right. They were designed to resemble the male genitalia, with 2 round bulges designed to look like testicles. These were really common in the Tudor period. I know to us they seem incredibly rude, but it was really common to see men walking down the street positioned with these in their groin area. Let's move on to this cabinet and even more tools of his trade. We can see a gauge for iron shot. That's marked with number 14. And he would use this tool to check the shot to ensure it was the correct size for the cannon. And wow, look at these objects. The journal cover, that's number 12, and the rings. They tell us that the gunner was a well-educated man who did very well for himself. Now, he was wearing quite an ornate leather jerkin. Here's what remains of it. It's made from sheep's leather. There's also a powder flask made from horn, very useful for his line of work. It would be worn over the shoulder, and it has a metal cap that's marked with number 2. Next is this little thimble ring. This was actually found on his skeletal finger, and it would have been used for sewing canvas cartridges. In the folds of his jerkin were one of the 82 boxwood combs found on board, as well as this exquisite little pocket sundial, which, yes, was very accurate. Now that we've seen some of the treasures of this magnificent vessel, let's talk about what has made it so very famous in our lifetime. The fact that it was raised from the seafloor. The Mary Rose was raised on October 11th, 1982, finally returning home here to Portsmouth, where she was built centuries earlier. But the process of raising this wreck started a decade and a half earlier and was propelled by one man in particular, Alexander McKee. Here's his bust at the museum. Remember, we saw the bronze gun that he had used to ID the ship a bit earlier. He launched Project Solent ships along with land archaeologist Margaret Rule. Here she is. Together, they scoured charts from the 19th century and discovered a Navy hydrographic chart dated 1841. It revealed the positions of 3 historic wrecks, one of which would turn out to be the Mary Rose. Teams of volunteer divers combed the area, and they began to see stray pieces of timber. Then they found the aforementioned wrought iron gun, as well as 30 meters of ship's frames. The Mary Rose had been found at long last. But now what? Underwater archaeologists began excavations and learned that the ship was on her starboard side at a 60-degree angle from the vertical. The Mary Rose Trust was formed in 1979, and it was decided that all attempts should be made to raise the vessel and create a museum in Portsmouth. An organized team and base were set up, staffed by full-time archaeologists, fine staff, conservators, fundraisers, and admin folks, as well as more than 500 volunteer divers. That same year, the salvage vessel Sleipner was moored on site, which allowed the divers and conservators to work in shifts, and this really sped things up. But the biggest event was yet to happen. On 11th October 1982, supported by a purpose-built frame, the Mary Rose was raised with hydraulic jacks. It was then transferred into this bespoke steel cradle and placed back into the sea, and when the weather and the tides were just right, the cradle was raised to the surface, placed on a barge, and towed ashore. Okay, it was raised, but it wasn't stable or ready to go on display. In fact, it was incredibly precarious and delicate, and at risk of being destroyed by oxygen. So first, a building was constructed around the hull, and a titanium frame was installed. Then, to prevent shrinkage and warping, it was preserved through a 34-year process, the first stage of which involved being sprayed with cold fresh water for 12 years. Let me know in the comments if you saw it during any of these times. The cold water spray was done to remove salt and stop decay from advancing in the air, and then it was sprayed for 2 more decades, yes, decades, with polyethylene glycol, aka PEG, which strengthens the wood. From 1984 onwards, viewers could view the ship as it was doused. It was quite pokey, as you can see, but towards the end of the PEG spray, plans were proposed for a new museum, designed by Wilkinson Eyre and Perkins and Will. In 2009, the old ship hall was demolished, and construction began on this new museum, one of the most spectacular in the country, in my opinion, which opened in 2013 to coincide with the end of the PEG spraying. In 2009, the old ship hall was demolished and construction began on this new museum, one of the most spectacular in the country in my opinion, which was opened in 2013 to coincide with the end of the PEG spraying. This was an incredibly challenging project as the museum was built over the ship in the dry dock, which is a heritage-listed structure in its own right. For the first 3 years that it was open, the ship was encased in glass to create a, quote, hot box in which to dry the ship. It needed 3 full years of drying, so we would have only been able to see it through glass then. From 2016 to today, the ship is kept in 55% relative humidity and at 19 degrees Celsius, and there are pest traps everywhere to keep track of any insect activity. In any museum, this is a big deal, but could you imagine woodworm turning up in here? Just a few more words about the architecture. The structure was designed to look like an oyster shell, with the Mary Rose as the pearl on the inside. Now, in a few minutes, we're going to talk about the Flemish chef, Nye Cope, and the marks that he would make on his objects. We can see some similar symbols on the outside of the buildings. This is very much intentional. The black timber cladding is covered in replicas of these personal owner marks, almost like personal tags. Now here is the skeleton of an archer royal. Of course, while the big guns and little guns were important to a ship like this, and we'll talk more about them, good old-fashioned longbow archers were also integral to a battle's success. That brings us to the point that there are a lot of human remains on display at this museum. The excavation yielded around 9,000 human bones, with many of them reassembled back into their skeletons. Starting with Dr. Anne Sterland, a prominent bioarchaeologist, hundreds of archaeologists have done a huge amount of research into the skeletons of the men on board, and they have learned a lot about the injuries and illnesses that plagued them, like rickets and arthritis and so much more. The skeletons are able to be on public display in accordance with the 2004 Human Tissue Act, because they are more than 100 years old and they have educational value. I'll be making a video about the ethics of displaying human remains in the future.
I really like all of this inclusion about conservation and curation. I really love it when museums show off how the museum itself actually works.
All right, now we're walking back onto one of these gangways, looking in the side galleries. Honestly, this curation is phenomenal. This is a well-funded museum, and it really shows. Everything is sleek and easy to understand. It just feels expensive, you know? You can see recreated mock-ups of the cabins and some living quarters. And remember, these are all original artifacts from the ship, recovered from the wreck site. Excavating this was such a meticulous process, and I just want to again state my awe for the archaeologists. Excavation on land is hard enough, but just imagine doing this underwater. Wow. Let's move on to the cook and the galley. This is so neat. Here, now look at the lid of this tankard. We can see the words Nai Kop on this lid, and Nai Kop is incised on a bowl in one of the lower decks. Again, these are just like the symbols that we saw on the outside of the museum. Here is another man found beside the galley, also potentially a cook. Feeding all of these men definitely wasn't a one-man job. And just look at this menu. Flesh, fish, biscuits, beer. A lot of food was discovered at the site. Nai Kop and his team were feeding 500 men. They ate a lot of beef. 8 casks containing over 2,000 butchered cow bones were recovered. That's a lot, but the sailors' daily rations list that they were allotted about 1 kilo of beef each per day. Of course, as usual, the officers ate a higher quality of food, and wealthy Tudors loved venison. It was served to them roasted, cooked on a spit above the galley ovens. 2 haunches of fallow deer were found in the storage areas. Of course, because of religious holidays and observances, there were some days when you could not or should not eat meat, and you should eat fish instead, and this was also the case on the ship. Despite being at sea, the cooks needed reliable access to huge stocks of fish, and casks were found that contained salted haddock, hake, eel, and salted cod. The cod was actually caught near Newfoundland. The men also did get a little bit of fresh veg, such as peas, and a small amount of fruit was discovered, but again, this was probably for the officers. Finally, of course, the men drank beer. Each sailor was rationed 1 gallon of table beer a day, but before you get too excited, remember that that was only about 1 to 2% and was more for sanitation purposes than anything else, as well as the inclusion of vitamins and minerals. Cheers, mateys. Now let's meet a few more specific members of the crew. Here's the purser, and this is the artist's interpretation of his features based on his skull. He was trapped with his chest, which contained many gold coins. He ranked just below the master, and he was in charge of paying the crew, keeping accounts, and buying supplies. He also gave out the rations, so it would have paid to be on his good side. And as we've seen already, the higher-ranking men, the ones with their own cabins, they often had these gentlemen's chests where they stored their precious objects. These are so fascinating. The ship was not exclusively crewed by white Englishmen. No, there was a whole array of different ethnicities and nationalities on board, including this man, who's often called the Italian gentleman. He was found trapped between a gun and a large chest, and it's really actually very sad when you think about the way that these men went down with the ship. Now let's finish our tour today by talking about defending the ship. We've already talked about weapons a little bit, but remember, weapons and defense was the entire purpose of this vessel. There were so many weapons on board. Yes, the cannons and the big guns, and we've talked about the archers briefly, but let's have a look at the Archer Royal. He was found on the main deck in the middle of the ship, and his broken longbow was beside him. Due to the fact he wore a leather wrist guard with Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon's badges, it's thought that he was a royal archer, a highly skilled individual, the best of the best, part of the royal army. He was in his early 20s and around 5 foot 10 inches tall. His teeth show that he was raised in a hot climate, and it is thought that he may have been North African. Now, I love this fact. He had grooves on his finger bones because of the repetitive action of drawing his longbow. We can see loads of bows that have been recovered, and arrows, but each longbow is crafted from a single piece of yew. The bowyer carefully shapes the staves to maximize the sapwood's flexibility while preserving the wood's strength, resulting in an ideal, naturally springy bow. Look at these handguns, and note the Tudor spelling. Throughout the 16th century, handheld gun usage increased, and on the Mary Rose, parts of 7 handguns have been discovered. There are 3 different styles. 3 of these are matchlocks imported from Brescia in Italy that fired cast iron shot. Just one of the ways that the men defended the ship. I mean, there's just so much to see here, but that is the end of our tour today.
Well, that's the end of our tour. I hope you've enjoyed learning about this absolutely fascinating Tudor time capsule as much as I've enjoyed showing it to you. I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum.